I called this talk Design versus the Oil Industry, but it could also be called my experience and frustration with making change in the oil industry in a time of climate crisis. So I actually just recently returned to ThinkPlace after a 2-year stint working at a company called Z Energy in New Zealand. And that's New Zealand's largest fossil fuel retailer, importer and refiner until recently. So there's 2 words that kind of describe my story or my experience and this talk tonight. The first is hope, and the second is frustration. So I'll start with hope. Good place to start. And when I went into Z, I went in full of hope. I went in full of hope that I could actively change the way that that company operated in order to make a real positive environmental impact by working within a big player within the fossil fuel sector in New Zealand. And at the same time, there was a growing number of people who were just like me, who had joined that company to help make that transition away from fossil fuels a reality. And fundamentally, I joined because I believe that you make the greatest change from within a system. So you might be wondering, why did I come back? Why did I leave? And kind of, in one word, being inside that slow-moving beast was incredibly frustrating. Nina just talked about kind of playing the long game. And so this is a little bit of reflection on what it's like to be inside a company while you're playing the long game. It's also about kind of how the aspirations and the good intentions that a company has are traded off against commercial realities, and how I believe that regulation and really good policy is probably the most effective tool that we have to take action on climate change, so that companies like Z in New Zealand and around the world have to change the way that they operate. So I'll start with why it was frustrating. Prior to what we might think, individually, we're not actually changing our behaviour currently. We talk a really good game as consumers, but fuel sales aren't yet declining. And in New Zealand, at least, there's record fuel prices. So despite all of that, and despite the massive climate impacts that our everyday decisions have. But I want to make it really clear is that it's not just individuals who need to change. And in particular, it's big companies like Z and governments making the rules that will make a real difference. So there's 3 brief examples that I want to give which help to illustrate kind of some of these attempts at change. And the first is around biofuels, which many countries are either using or introducing. In 2015, Z invested $26 million to set up a local biofuel production facility using tallow, which is a meat kind of byproduct. However, it's really, really expensive to do this. And in Z's case, at least, it ended up being twice the cost of normal mineral diesel. And so you have to have some really damn committed consumers and customers to buy that stuff. The other problem is that the tallow also exists on the open market. And what's happening now is that stuff is getting bought up by overseas investors. And actually it's ending up going to Singapore to be turned into biofuel there. The second example is a consumer example. It's this thing that we produced while I was there called Carbon Count, which was an in-app kind of digital product. And basically it let you offset your carbon emissions based on what you had purchased through fuel purchases at Z. And then you pay that fee and offset those through sustainable forestry. But the unfortunate thing is that because the commercial reality that we couldn't make money off it, it was really, really hard to convince anybody to invest any kind of marketing budget in it. And the outcome of that was that we ended up with a base of about 100 active monthly customers per month, and one of them was me. And the third example, or kind of illustrative point, is this attempt to transition away from fossil fuels as a big producer. Z over the years has made big investments, one of them being a $30 million investment in a power retailer here in New Zealand called Flick, and also other kind of tangential industries and other investments, but these haven't yet paid off. These big bets haven't yet paid off. And so these 3 examples lead me to kind of my key point. As a publicly traded company that's listed on both the NZX and the ASX, you won't survive unless you're returning value to your shareholders. And in Z's case, this means paying a dividend every 6 months. And what it ultimately means is it's really hard to make those big investments, those long-term investments, those big bets, unless they pay off straight away. And that was the sort of experience of working within Z. And it's that kind of short-term profit-focused thinking that constrains listed companies from being able to really change the way they operate. Z has a turnover of about 2 billion New Zealand dollars a year. There's more than 500 employees, and annual profits regularly exceed 100 million, and in good years, it's close to 400 million. And so the question I have is, can a company like that really change because of its own best intentions and its own best kind of aspirations? If you know me, you'll know that I'm not normally a pessimist, but in this case, I believe the answer is no. And this is where I think that effective, well-designed and well-crafted policy and regulation can come in, and that we can design and have an impact on. So I talked before about biofuels. This year, New Zealand introduced a biofuels mandate, which means that companies have a stipulation on them to produce a certain percentage, 2.5% of their total sales of fuel to be biofuels. And those kind of things can start to make investments like Z's worth it. And that's the government giving a really clear directive to fuel importers and retailers that they need to change the way they operate and the kind of products that they're selling. There's also a new fee-bate scheme, part fee, part rebate, which is where people who purchase EVs and low emission vehicles receive a rebate, which is paid for by a fee on higher emitting vehicles. And that incentivizes consumers to shop differently instead of just offsetting. And it also rewards companies who invest and produce and sell more efficient vehicles. And so within all of that is that there is a glimmer of hope. And so if you're one of those think places, kind of like I was at one point, who are young and new to the game, and you end up on a massive government project and you wonder to yourself, what am I doing? What's the impact am I having? Why am I here? And how will my work help? I think of these as a couple of examples. I think of the people who wrote that policy and that regulation, and then being able to point to the tangible impact that they have started to make. So unfortunately, change can be slow, and ultimately that's what frustrated me into leaving and returning to ThinkPlace. But to really make the kind of change that's required, we as designers really need to pull the big switches, the big levers, and many of them and pretty fast. Companies like Z, who have the best of intentions, are everywhere, but I don't think they have the ability to change on their own fast enough or effectively enough unless we can radically change our expectations. And whether that's through rules or through policy or the kind of purchases or investments that we make, either individually or collectively. And so just before I finish, I want to leave you with a kai koho, which is a Māori expression of hope. No mai ngā hua, no mai ngā pai, no mai kia nui, kia hā weri ai. Kia ora.